What does a double-tailed devil have to do with a prince, a Cadillac, or a Jedi? Or what happens when you piss Uncle Sam off so badly that he decides to send out his most advanced killing machine halfway across the world just to eliminate one specific man? You see, this isn't yet another classic World War II fighter story. This is the story of an aircraft that broke every rule, defied every expectation, and tried to murder its own pilots before it murdered anyone else. An aircraft so radical that two young officers had to trick their own military into letting them build it. So uncomfortable that pilots flew it in their underwear, and so effective that it became the only American fighter in production from Pearl Harbor to VJ Day. This is the Lockheed P-38 Lightning, the fork-tailed devil that changed everything. Well, our story begins, as many do, actually with a lie. It's 1937, the world is sliding toward war, and America is still pretending it won't get involved. The US Army Air Corps has a problem. Its current fighters are slow, short-ranged, and about as threatening to a modern bomber as a passive-aggressive email. But there's another problem, possibly worse than the technological one. Regulations? The Army had decided that pursuit aircraft, that's what they called fighters back then because apparently fighter was too exciting, had to be single-engine designs. Budget reasons, tradition, the usual bureaucratic nonsense that happens when people who don't fly planes make rules for people who do. Enter two young officers who looked at those regulations and thought, yeah, that's adorable. First Lieutenants Benjamin Kelsey and Gordon Saville knew what America would need when war came. Anyone with a map and a newspaper could see war was coming. They needed something big, something with range, something with two engines, and enough firepower to actually matter, something that could escort bombers to their targets instead of waving goodbye at the coast and hoping for the best. But the rules said no, so these two lieutenants did what every frustrated military officer eventually learns to do. They changed the words. Let's not call it a pursuit aircraft, one of them suggested. Let's call it an interceptor. An interceptor, of course. Completely different thing. It intercepts bombers on their way to targets. It's basically a flying defense system. The regulations don't say anything about interceptors having to be single-engine. In a way, that's the military equivalent of telling your wife you didn't buy a motorcycle, you bought alternative transportation. This is genuinely how the term interceptor entered American military aviation vocabulary, not because of some tactical doctrine or strategic revelation, because two lieutenants needed a loophole and weren't above a little creative writing to get it. The specifications they wrote were deliberately absurd. 360 miles per hour at altitude, climb to 20,000 feet in 6 minutes. These specs were the aviation equivalent of walking into a car dealership in 1937 and asking for a Tesla with a laser gun on its roof. To be honest, if you handed these requirements to an aircraft designer today, they'd probably laugh. But back then, they just assumed someone was drunk. Several aircraft companies took one look and politely declined. Others submitted designs that were basically apologetic shrugs in blueprint form. And then there was Lockheed. You see, Lockheed in 1937 was not the aerospace giant you know today. They were small, they were hungry, they had exactly zero experience building military fighters. What they did have was a young engineer named Clarence Kelly Johnson, a man who would grow up to design the SR-71 Blackbird and the U-2 spy plane, but who at this point was just a very talented troublemaker with a slide rule and a complete disregard for the word impossible. Johnson and his boss, Hall Hibbard, needed a place to work on their secret project, somewhere away from corporate oversight, somewhere they could think weird thoughts and build weird planes without management asking uncomfortable questions like, is that structurally sound? And why does it have two tails? They found an abandoned bourbon distillery in Burbank, California. This, I swear this is true, was the first location of what would become the legendary Skunk Works. Somehow, the birthplace of America's most advanced secret aircraft program was a building that used to make booze. If that's not the most American origin story possible, I don't know what is. Johnson's team considered dozens of configurations, conventional layouts, push-pull engines, things that looked like normal airplanes. They kept rejecting ideas until they arrived at something nobody had ever tried: twin booms. Picture a small central pod, just big enough for a pilot and some guns, with two long engine nacelles stretching back on either side, each ending in its own tail structure. The whole thing is connected by a horizontal stabilizer. It looked like something a 7-year-old would draw if you asked them to design a spaceship. It was brilliant. The twin booms solved multiple problems at once. They housed the engines, the landing gear, and most importantly, the turbo superchargers that would give the plane performance at altitudes where other fighters couldn't breathe. The central nacelle concentrated everything important in one place: pilot, controls, and an absolutely obscene amount of firepower pointed straight ahead. And those twin engines with counter-rotating propellers, they solved one of aviation's oldest headaches: torque. Single-engine fighters pulled to the left on takeoff because of the way the propeller spun. The P-38's engines spun in opposite directions, cancelling that effect. This wasn't just convenient, it was a lifesaver when pilots had to fly home on one engine after getting shot up. On January 27, 1939, the XP-38 prototype took to the skies for the first time. It was unlike anything the world had ever seen. Lieutenant Kelsey, one of the officers who'd dreamed up this whole scheme, wanted to prove the XP-38 wasn't just a laboratory curiosity. In February 1939, he proposed a transcontinental speed dash from California to New York. General Hap Arnold, who never met a publicity stunt he didn't love, approved immediately. Kelsey took off from California and pointed east. 7 hours and 2 minutes later, he approached Mitchell Field in New York, having shattered the existing transcontinental record so thoroughly that aviation journalists dropped their pencils. There was just one small problem. He arrived so fast that ground control wasn't ready for him. They hadn't expected him for another hour. No landing clearance, no preparations, and his fuel tanks were running empty. The revolutionary aircraft that had just proven it could outfly anything in existence belly landed on a golf course and tore itself to pieces. The only prototype, the proof of concept, destroyed because it was too damn fast and nobody was ready. Most programs would have died right there, but the Army looked at the wreckage, looked at the flight time and said, "Build us more." Sometimes crashing into a golf course is actually a successful test, but the Army didn't know what they were really buying. As this plane had a secret, a very dark one that would kill its own test pilots before it killed anyone else. When early P-38s dove at high speeds, something terrifying happened. The controls would stiffen, then lock up entirely. The nose would tuck under, pointing the aircraft steeper and steeper toward the ground. The faster you went, the worse it got, until the pilot was just a passenger in a metal coffin screaming toward Earth with absolutely no way to pull out. Engineers called it compressibility. The air flowing over the wings approached the speed of sound, creating shock waves that disrupted control surfaces. Pilots had a name for it that would make a trucker blush. Lockheed test pilot Ralph Verdon drew the short straw. In November 1941, Verdon took a P-38 up to investigate the compressibility problem. We don't know exactly what he experienced up there. We know he pushed the aircraft into a high-speed dive. We know the controls were locked. We know he fought the stick as the ground rushed up to meet him. But we also sadly know he didn't make it. Verdon's death wasn't meaningless. The data from his final dive helped engineers understand what was happening, but it would take until 1943 to develop dive recovery flaps that finally tamed the problem. For 2 years, P-38 pilots flew combat, knowing that if they dove too steeply, their own aircraft might simply decide to kill them. And still they flew because war doesn't wait for engineering solutions. Now let me tell you about the guns, because this is where the P-38 really earned its terrifying reputation. Every other American fighter mounted its weapons in the wings. The P-47 Thunderbolt had 8.50 caliber machine guns, 4 in each wing. The P-51 Mustang had 6 devastating armaments, but they had a geometry problem. Wing-mounted guns fire at angles toward each other. They have to be harmonized, adjusted so the bullet streams converge at a specific distance, usually around 300 to 400 yards. Closer than that, your bullets pass on either side of the target. Miss by 50 yards at range, you're shooting at empty sky. The P-38 said, "What if we just didn't do that?" 4.50 caliber machine guns and 120mm cannon, all concentrated in the nose, all pointing straight ahead, all firing parallel to each other. No convergence zone, no sweet spot. At 100 yards, devastating. At 400 yards, still lethal. At 750 yards, it was still dangerous when wing-mounted guns were basically just making noise. Dick Bong, who would become America's highest-scoring ace with 40 victories, all in P-38s, described his tactics simply, "I'd get in close, real close. Sometimes I'd fly through the debris of my target. That's not flying, that's hunting." But that's not all. Enemy pilots noticed the P-38. They couldn't help but notice. German pilots in North Africa gave it a name that stuck, the forktailed devil. Sure, everything sounds scary or strange in German. But when the Luftwaffe, who thought they were the best pilots in the world, starts calling your plane the devil, you've made an impression. When that distinctive silhouette appeared on the horizon, with those twin booms and that central cockpit, the German pilots knew they were in for a very bad day. The P-38 was one of the first American fighters with the range to escort bombers all the way to their targets and back. And the Germans hated it. The Japanese had a different reaction, a very confused one. They looked at that twin-boom configuration and came up with the name two planes, one pilot. In other words, two planes joined together that were controlled by one incredibly skilled pilot that coordinated both halves simultaneously. This would explain why it seemed to them so deadly, so coordinated, so impossible to shoot down. The Japanese reaction was one of complete confusion. Seeing the twin-boom configuration, they coined the nickname two planes, one pilot. They theorized it was actually two aircraft joined together, controlled by a single, incredibly skilled pilot who simultaneously coordinated both halves. This belief explained why the plane seemed so lethal, so coordinated, and virtually impossible for them to shoot down. Now, here's where Kelly Johnson's engineering genius becomes indistinguishable from cruelty. The P-38 was big, it was heavy, and in 1939 they didn't have engines powerful enough to drag all that weight through the sky at the speeds the Army wanted. Johnson's solution was elegant and absolutely brutal. Strip out everything that made pilots comfortable. The cockpit was so small that taller pilots spent entire missions folded up like a toy in a Kinder Surprise egg. The seat was barely wider than a bicycle saddle. There were no built-in oxygen tanks. Pilots climbed aboard with portable tanks strapped to them, like scuba divers preparing for a very dry dive at 30,000 feet. And the canopy opened on a hinge, straight up instead of sliding back on rails. Rails would have added weight. This seems like a minor engineering decision until you're flying at altitude over the Pacific with the tropical sun beating down on you through that glass. Other fighter pilots could slide their canopies back and catch some breeze. Because of its hinge design, the P-38's canopy could not be opened at altitude, as it would rip off, likely killing the pilot. So there they sat, baking like cookies in a flying oven. There was no air conditioning, no fan, nothing. The P-38 in the Pacific Theater was essentially a flying sauna that occasionally shot at people, so the pilots adapted. They would pose for photographs in full flight gear, leather jackets, flight suits, looking every inch the heroic aviator. Then they'd strip down to undershirts and shorts for the actual mission, sometimes less. There are reports of men flying in combat wearing nothing but underwear and dog tags. They posed for photos in their clothes. They flew in their undies. This led to one of my favorite footnotes in aviation history. When P-38 pilots got shot down and captured by Japanese forces, the soldiers who found them would stare in confusion at these nearly naked Americans. Legend has it that Japanese soldiers wrote in their diaries, "The war must be ending soon. The Americans don't even have money for uniforms anymore." By the end of the war, Lockheed finally gave the P-38 pilots a small mercy, a ventilation fan in the cockpit. It took them until 1945 to add a fan. The pilots had been asking since 1942, better late than never, I suppose. But that's not all. The P-38 could also go places no other American fighter could go. Internal fuel gave its range that made other fighters look like they were on leashes. Add drop tanks, and you could fly over 2,500 miles. In the Pacific, where islands were separated by hundreds of miles of ocean, this wasn't just useful, it was a strategic transformation in airplane form. And all of this, the range, the firepower, the altitude performance, was about to matter very, very much. December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor. The Pearl Harbor attack was a serious sucker punch that flew from somewhere in the back to a soft spot. 2,403 Americans were dead, ship sinking. But above it all, the man who planned it all, Japanese Admiral Yamamoto, was untouchable. 4,000 miles away on an island in the Pacific, protected by his fleet speaking in codes America couldn't break. For 16 months, America burned with that knowledge. Every casualty report, every funeral, every mother who got a telegram, Yamamoto's face was in every newspaper, in every wanted poster. The architect of Pearl Harbor, the man who'd woken a sleeping giant and lived to brag about it. The Navy wanted him dead, the Army wanted him dead, the American public wanted him dead, but he was untouchable, protected by distance, defended by his fleet, speaking in codes America couldn't crack. America tried to strike back. The Doolittle raid in April 1942 with 16 B-25 bombers was a shock that proved Japan's mainland could be touched, but the attack was a psychological win, not a fatal one. 2 months later, the strategic victory at Midway was immense. The Navy smashed the Japanese fleet, sinking 4 carriers. The war was turning, yet the source of America's pain, Admiral Yamamoto, was still alive. The man who started it all was still out there, still plotting, still untouchable. Every victory tasted incomplete. Every medal ceremony had its ghost watching from the shadows. But here's the thing about Uncle Sam and revenge. It might take a while, it might cost a lot of money, but eventually he'll find you. And when he does, there's a good chance he'll stick a boot up your ass. It's the American way. And so, on April 13th, 1943, things were about to change. The American code breakers had been working around the clock. unraveling secrets hidden in Japanese naval communications. But what they discovered that morning brought them to an absolute halt. A routine administrative message in the form of a travel itinerary. On paper, it seemed like insignificant bureaucratic paperwork, except for the person it was made for. Admiral Yamamoto, Japan's greatest strategic mind. The man was personally responsible for 2,403 dead Americans on December 7, 1941. The untouchable man was about to make himself very, very touchable. He was about to fly, out in the open, exposed, and the Japanese, being Japanese, had scheduled it with obsessive precision. The message was chillingly specific. On April 18th, Yamamoto would depart his location at Rabaul, a part of modern-day Papua New Guinea, at 6 a.m. He would arrive at an airfield located in one of the islands nearby at 8 a.m. He would inspect frontline troops. He would return that evening. The codebreakers stared at the message. Then they picked up the phone. Admiral Chester Nimitz had a choice that would haunt him either way. Yamamoto wasn't just any Japanese officer, he was a national symbol, the George Washington of their navy, a hero who had built Japanese naval power from almost nothing. Killing him would devastate Japanese morale. His replacement would inevitably be less capable. The strategic value was enormous, but there was a catch. A big one. If Americans killed Yamamoto at exactly the time and place his itinerary specified, the Japanese would know their codes had been broken. They'd change everything. New ciphers, new procedures, new communication methods. The intelligence advantage that had been winning battles would evaporate overnight. Future operations would be planned blind. Men would die because of it. Was one admiral worth that price? Nimitz consulted Washington. President Roosevelt was informed. The decision came back fast. Do it! Kill Yamamoto! And that's how Operation Vengeance was born. This wasn't a strategy anymore. This was revenge. Pearl Harbor had killed 2,403 Americans, and the man who planned it was about to fly right into range, and it was payback time. But there was a minor issue. Balele Airfield in the Pacific was 400 miles from the nearest American base. On Guadalcanal, round trip, at least 800 miles, more like 1,000 when you factor in navigation legs, combat maneuvering, and not flying in a straight line that screamed, "We're coming to kill someone." No American fighter had that kind of range. The P-51 Mustang? Nope. The F-4U Corsair? Too thirsty. The P-47 Thunderbolt? It couldn't carry enough gas if you strapped tanks to its tanks. Only one aircraft could do it, the weird one, the uncomfortable one, the one that looked like a kid's drawing and had tried to kill its own test pilots. The P-38 Lightning, with external drop tanks, could make the journey. Barely, with nothing to spare. Every gallon is calculated, every mile planned. The mission parameters were absolutely brutal. To avoid detection, the P-38s would fly at 50 feet above the ocean, so low that Japanese radar couldn't see them, so close to the water that one moment of inattention meant death, complete radio silence. Navigation by dead reckoning across a featureless ocean, arrival timing measured in minutes. Yamamoto was famous for his punctuality. The man was so precise, even his death would be on schedule. But there was a catch. If they arrived early, Japanese radar would spot them climbing. If they arrived late, he'd be on the ground. If they got lost, which would be incredibly easy with no landmarks and no radio aids, they'd run out of fuel and die in the Pacific. Major John Mitchell was given command. He was a meticulous planner, which was good, because this mission required meticulous planning or everyone would die. Mitchell hand-selected 18 of his best pilots. The plan was elegant. 4 P-38s would be the killer flight. Their only job was to destroy Yamamoto's aircraft. 4 more would cover the killers. 10 would fly high cover against the Zeros that would inevitably respond. Every detail was calculated with obsessive precision. Drop tanks were added, watches were synchronized. The flight path was plotted turn by turn, with compass headings and time marks for each leg. They would fly at 50 feet for over 3 hours, then climb rapidly at exactly the right moment to intercept. April 18, 1943, 07:25 hours, the P-38s began their takeoff roll from Henderson Field, Guadalcanal. 2 aircraft had to abort due to mechanical problems. 16 continued. They descended to 50 feet and pointed toward Bougainville. For over 3 hours, they flew in absolute silence. Try to imagine it. Holding an aircraft 50 feet above the ocean for 3 hours. Waves rushing at you constantly, your eyes playing tricks on you as you're fighting the voice in your head begging you to pull up and gain altitude, just enough to give yourself some margin. But any altitude puts you on Japanese radar. Any radio transmission gives you away. Finally, after 3 hours of precision navigation across a featureless ocean, 16 American fighters were exactly where they needed to be, exactly when they needed to be there. Mitchell gave the signal. and the formation began their climb. A few minutes later, the Japanese formation appeared, right on time. Japanese punctuality, meet American revenge. What happened next took less than 2 minutes. Two Mitsubishi G4M Betty bombers, Yamamoto in the lead aircraft, escorted by 6 Zero fighters. The Zeros were flying relaxed, confident that they were in friendly airspace. No American aircraft could possibly be here, 400 miles from anywhere. But they were about to have the worst Sunday of their lives. Captain Thomas Lanphier and Lieutenant Rex Barber dove on the formation. The Zeros reacted, but too late. Those concentrated nose guns, 4.50 caliber and a 20mm cannon, all firing straight ahead, no convergence zone, just pure concentrated destruction, tore into the lead bomber. Yamamoto's aircraft caught fire. The wings separated. Japan's greatest naval strategist spiraled into the Bougainville jungle, still clutching his samurai sword. The second bomber ditched in the ocean. One P-38, piloted by Lieutenant Ray Hine, failed to return, the only American loss. The remaining 15 P-38s turned for home. Their fuel gauges touched empty as they landed. They had done what no other aircraft could have done. President Roosevelt was told only that Operation Vengeance has been completed. In Japan, they mourned Yamamoto like a fallen god. Emperor Hirohito personally grieved. Yamamoto's replacement, Admiral Koga, lacked his strategic vision and would die in another American operation just a year later. The Japanese Navy never recovered its brilliance. The fork-tailed devil had delivered America's revenge. But the P-38 didn't just dominate the air. It infected culture in ways that still ripple today. Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, the guy who wrote The Little Prince, flew unarmed P-38 recon missions over occupied France at 44 years old, way too old for combat flying, but he kept dodging orders to stay grounded. On July 31st, 1944, he took off and just disappeared over the Mediterranean. 56 years later, divers found his P-38 resting at the bottom of the seafloor. The P-38 also inspired another great piece of American legacy, originating from a surprising source. In Detroit, automobile designer Harley Earl visited Lockheed's plant during the war and saw the P-38. He was captivated by those twin-tail booms, those sleek lines, that sense of speed even when the aircraft was standing still. After the war, Earl channeled that inspiration into the 1948 Cadillac, the first production car with tail fins. We're not talking about some subtle influence. Earl specifically cited the P-38 as his direct inspiration. He wanted cars that looked like they were going 400 miles per hour, standing still. Those fins became the defining feature of American automotive design for 15 years. Every swooping, chrome-laden land yacht of the 1950s descended from Kelly Johnson's radical fighter. A Cadillac Eldorado is basically a P-38 that can't fly and has worse gas mileage. Now, let's fast forward a few decades to 1982. Around that time, George Lucas was working on Return of the Jedi, and he needed the sound of speeder bikes screaming through a forest. The sound designer, Ben Burt, needed something futuristic but mechanical, powerful but agile. So he started digging through World War II aircraft recordings. He finds the P-38, that deep mechanical growl. He layers it, processes it, mixes it with other engines like the one of P-51 and some other sounds, and the result? A match made in Jedi heaven. Every time you watch those speeder bikes racing through Endor, you're hearing ghosts of the fork-tailed devil. Fast forward to today. Lockheed Martin's most advanced fighter, the F-35, is officially called the Lightning II. That's not a random marketing decision. That's a direct tribute. The company Kelly Johnson, basically built from nothing, now constructs the most sophisticated combat aircraft on the planet, and they're still using his name. And that bourbon distillery approach, small teams, minimal bureaucracy, people thinking in ways that made their bosses uncomfortable, that became the Skunk Works model, the U-2. The SR-71 Blackbird, the F-117 stealth fighter, every one of them came from the same DNA. The P-38 Lightning started with 2 lieutenants lying on a government form, and it ended up changing aviation, literature, automotive design, and movie sound effects. It was uncomfortable. It tried to kill its own pilots. It made men fly in combat in their underwear. Sometimes the most revolutionary things look impossible until someone builds them anyway. The fork-tailed devil proved that. Well, that's just one glimpse of the incredible P-38 aircraft. But aviation history is full of moments like this, where one aircraft, one raid, or one decision changed everything. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to hit the like and subscribe buttons so you don't miss the next video. And I have one more crazy story from the history of aviation waiting for you on screen. Just click it and I'll see you on the other side.